more deaths. I was there for the month of January, and I was there for a part of June as well. And part of that work on the border doing humanitarian aid also is bringing the border back home. So that is what we are doing here tonight. I want to share a little bit of my motivation for that. I mean, we live in a time of extreme cruelty and really dire policies that target immigrants, both who already are here and those who seek to come here, with seemingly no chance for change. There's very much a bipartisan agreement that we need border security and don't come here and those kinds of things. And when you work in politics and you work for social change and you see something that seems so intractable, it's really quite defeating. It's really, it's devastating in a way. And I thought, because I'm a backpacker and I like to carry heavy things on my back and climb up mountains, that the chance to be in the desert and do something concrete, leave a gallon of water somebody, hand somebody a granola bar, just that concreteness was a bulwark against despair. So I want to start with that observation, and with it, my favorite quote from Grace Paley, who said, "The only recognizable feature of hope is action." And that really is what this work has meant to me. What I'm going to do tonight is talk a little bit about the setting, literally the environment that this work takes place in, describe a little bit about what that humanitarian work is, something about the people who are crossing, and then a bit about the politics of the border as they exist, and explaining why this situation is what it is, and end with a little bit of perspective from a Christian point of view, we being a Christian church, on the imperative to respond to the humanitarian aid crisis. And here comes Alicia Pitterson. Hi. Before I dive in, I want to say that I am extremely grateful to Sarah and Paul and to the Immigration Task Force for offering a piece of funding that helped make this work possible. It is free labor, as volunteer work is, and I had to get there and I had to get back and I had to not do other work while I was there, and all of those things were financial burdens, and the Immigration Task Force helped ease that burden. So I'm very grateful. And I'm glad to have this opportunity to share some of this experience. No More Deaths, No Más Muertes, is a humanitarian aid group whose mission is to mitigate death and suffering on the border. It's very straightforward. They do humanitarian aid, that is the bulk of their work is direct aid. They also do a good bit of research. The organization is volunteer-run, volunteer-led, and it's really, once you get inside of it, it's really extraordinary. It's hundreds of people, none of whom are paid, doing an extraordinary work and coordinating an extraordinary volume of work. So let me talk a little bit about the setting. The U.S. Mexico border in Arizona, which is where I was, is remote desert. Like you see in this picture, there are no roads, there are no Starbucks, there are no bus stops. There are, at best, some herd paths that animals have created that people follow. It's mountainous, which is to say hard to cross. It's wild, it's barren. It's also beautiful. I want to say that. It is really stunningly beautiful. And the contrast between the suffering that happens in this beautiful place and its natural beauty is one of the sort of the constants when you're out there. You feel that all the time. You look at a scene like this, the world spread out below you, you know, these jagged peaks, and, you know, and you think, wow. And then you think about what it means for people to traverse this terrain. There are some amazing sunsets and sunrises. That one, I think, is a sunset. And stunning vegetation. That's called a rainbow cactus. But as beautiful as the desert is, it bites. Everything in the desert bites. This is called a cholla cactus. And its distinguishing feature is that those little nubs on the end break off and then attach themselves to your flesh or your clothes. And it's their way of reproducing. They migrate to a whole new area that way, but in the meantime, they have punctured your flesh and they stick. They have like little glue and they stick in you. This is called an ocatilla, and you can see why it's a problem. And this is a fairly typical day of our work in the desert. Everything in this picture that is flora is bites. It's got spikes, it's got thorns, it's got pricks, it's got little stickers that come off on you. And it's highly unpleasant, I will say. You know, when I was hiking through the desert like this, I mean, part of it was in the summer, you know, the heat was intense, and in the winter, this is actually a photo from the winter. It was sometimes hot, it was sometimes cold. Carrying 4 or 5 gallons of water uphill was a lot of work. Thinking about the people making this journey and the life-threatening conditions they were in was a lot of work. But having these little things that were stuck inside my shirt somehow in my pants, under my socks, I don't even know how they got there, and constantly itching and constantly poking, and now I'm bleeding. I don't even know why I'm bleeding. That was really distressing. That was really distressing. And I was there for a few hours at a time, maybe a day, you know, maybe 7 or 8 hours at most. And then I could go home and take all of that stuff off and get in a shower and wash the blood off. And to think about people who have to live with that same poke and prick and sticker and stuff inside their clothes and the itch and the blood for day in and day out, week in and week out, is a way that I thought about the suffering in the crossing. It's not the same as the dehydration, you know, the threat from both cold and hot, but to me it really embodied sort of the suffering of this crossing. And the desert is also deadly, as I just alluded to. This is just a piece of a carcass of something that we found one day. I couldn't tell you what it is because I didn't do that well in biology. But animals are not the only things that die. People die on this crossing all the time. There's a tradition to mark a place of death with a cross and also with a gallon of water, water being the symbol of life. And when we go across a route where somebody has died and where there's a memorial marker, you know, sometimes the gallons are empty for reasons you could understand, and we replace it with a full gallon, and we stop and pray for a bit. But they're all over. Hundreds of people die every year crossing. Thousands have never been recovered. I will say more about that later. And in the summer, you know, the winter is one thing where sometimes the rain and even snow and wind were life-threatening. But the desert is at its most brutal in the summer. And the 110-degree days really, really were something. And we ran into reports regularly of people who had, you know, lost a companion on the way. Somebody had got left behind. When they went back to get him, he was dead. That is a regular occurrence. So that's a little bit about the environment, the natural environment that this work happens in, and you can see already by that why the work is necessary. I want to return to what I said about the work being all volunteer. No More Deaths has a really small staff. They have a logistics coordinator, which is basically God, right? To coordinate the trucks and the food and the water and everything. A volunteer coordinator who functions as the chief of staff, basically. And a part-time comms and part-time fundraiser. And everybody else, hundreds of people, are volunteers. It's volunteer run. And all of 100% of the field work, 100% of the work of providing the humanitarian aid is done by volunteers. So those staff people are in Tucson and they spend their days on the internet, basically, and the volunteers are in the field doing this work. So this is a random picture of a group that I was with in January where there was we called it a shed, but you can see it's actually an apartment that was housing donations, clothing donations mainly, but also medical donations. And what would happen is people would drive by, take their bag of donations and just throw it in the door. And we went in there one day, the assignment was, make order out of this, you know. So we sorted pants from shirts and coats from t-shirts and socks from shoes and created some order. But all volunteer-led. The main work that most volunteers do, although there are 3 buckets of work that I participated in. The biggest one is what we call water drops, where you go into the remote desert and you leave water, food, socks, blankets. And what this involves is getting a crew together of 3 to 5 people, getting one of the trucks that the organization owns, and then driving for maybe an hour on tiny little roads, you know, a state road and then a unnamed road and then a dirt road, and then something that looks like this that calls itself an unimproved road, but it's not really a road. It's just a little kind of hint of a trail with boulders and sometimes a steep drop off. And then you begin to understand why the trucks are so important. And then you drive on something like this in first gear for about an hour. That's to give you a sense of how remote it is, you know. And when we do this, you don't see anybody. You don't see another truck. You don't see another human being. You don't see anything. This is another piece of the road, so-called, right? And then you get out of the truck. You leave the truck somewhere at a designated spot. You get out. You pack your stuff. So you take, these are some young, healthy people. You take a couple of gallons of water each, you know, a couple hundred granola bars, blankets, socks. Those are the essentials. And then you hike. Sometimes you're hiking on something flat like this. More often you're hiking across hills or mountains, depending. I would call this a hill. And sometimes it's really steep. This particular trail here is known for it's the most difficult water drop that we do. And it's a brutal 2,000 feet up. And then you get somewhere and you leave all this stuff. And in this picture, you see right here, right there, there's a little blue dot. That's our supplies that we left there, seen from a distance in the desert. And in this picture, it's right here. You can sort of see it. And then I did one more up close. It's kind of fuzzy here. To give you a sense of scale, right? And that's what it looks like up close. That is an SPSA hat. I'm just wearing it backwards. You put the gallons, depending on how many milk crates you have, you put the gallons underneath them and then stack rocks on top of them. That's to keep the animals from drinking the water, right? I mean, we love the animals, but it's there for the people. And then there are buckets where you put the food, same thing, big rocks on top. The blankets, depending, either hang in the tree or you leave on the ground. And then you hike back. But first you take the garbage out. Like, so there'll be, 10, 20 empty gallons there. There'll be oftentimes a lot of garbage. We do haul out a bag of garbage from every place and then hike back to the car, which looks something like this. And again, remote, right? This is the truck, and these are my companions from that particular hike. So that's the first part of the work. It's the work that I think No More Deaths is most famously known for, doing these water drops along the migrant routes in the desert. The organization of it on the back end is phenomenal. Like, everything is on a big spreadsheet. Like, there are different routes that have different drops, and like everything's up to date. Like, when you do a drop, you record what you found, what you left, so that anybody looking at it can discern like what's needed next without there being a boss that has to tell you to do it, right? And it's a total of about 130 routes. 130 drops on like 25 or 30 different routes, covering a few hundred miles. The second bucket of work that I participated in is helping maintain one of the humanitarian aid camps that No More Deaths runs. There's 2 camps that they run. I didn't get to visit the second one, which is in Ajo, and is jointly run with the Samaritans. This camp, called Bird Camp, is a No More Deaths camp that's been around for quite a while and has slowly and surely built up some infrastructure. You may see the light bulb here that is run by solar and a generator, but so is the fridge. So the light bulb is really not sucking up most of that energy. But that fridge, for people who have had nothing but the damn granola and dry beans that we've left in the desert for weeks, is, a godsend. Fresh fruit, sometimes meat, vegetables. So that's a big piece of it. Water, of course, is always the essential. That water is donated by other organizations, and there is a small well on the property as well. There are sleeping tents like this, several of them. And compared to where these folks have been, this is the Hilton. This camp, and the toilets. These are composting toilets, which is the most phenomenal technology in the world. I will not go into it, but ask me about it afterwards, because it is really great. And there's 6 of those. There are times that there are 80 or 90 people in this camp. So, the infrastructure has to be built to a volume that people can, use facilities at that volume. The camp used to be staffed 24/7 by No More Deaths volunteers, which is to say, when somebody came in, there was always somebody to greet them. In the pandemic, in the first year of the pandemic, that became untenable. They had really, and they to this day have really fantastic COVID protocols, really good, safe protocols. But doing that while running this camp on an all-volunteer basis was just breaking. And they made a decision that they just could not staff it that way anymore. And what they did was convert it to a self-serve kind of a place. By investing in the infrastructure, including those composting toilets, which need maintenance less often than the thing that they replaced. So like when you walk into that camp, there's a big bulletin board that says everything here is free, and it gives you a list of what's where. There's medical supplies, there's food, there's a clothing shed, all that kind of stuff. And volunteers are there probably 5-6 days a week for a few hours at a time. Sometimes I spent several nights there, so sometimes overnight. And we restock, we do an inventory, we restock everything, we clean the toilets, we make food, we do the dishes. The people that come through do all those things too. Well, they don't clean the toilets, but they do dishes and they cook and all those kinds of things. But when we're there, we do as much of that as we can, and at the end of it, we haul out a whole mess of trash and dirty laundry, and then we bring in clean laundry and start the cycle over again. That cat's name is Tahine, and he is the mayor of Bird Camp, as far as I am concerned. So that's the second bucket of work. The third bucket of work is new in No More Deaths portfolio, and it takes place directly on the border walls. And this is, those of you who haven't seen it, this is the damn wall. And the thing about this wall is the wall runs along this imaginary line that divides the part of Mexico we stole from the part we didn't steal. And it's a straight line on a map. And in order to build a wall on this straight line, they had to build a road on a straight line. But if you've ever been in the desert, that's not how you build roads. Roads wind in and out of the washes. But because they had to build on this straight imaginary line, these roads are roller coasters. They are literally roller coasters, and they flood, and they're incredibly hard to get up and down, and it just adds to the absurdity, obscene absurdity that is the border. This is a side view. This is taken from a makeshift camp that No More Deaths and the Samaritans created. So what started happening somewhere in November is that there was a flood of people that were coming through sections of this wall. Because the wall, here's the best part. The wall is built in good American fashion by privatized contractors who are each paid to build a section, but are not paid to connect them. So there are, gaps in the wall. I mean, is that not the most American story? Right? There are also very long stretches, where it's just wall, and there are places where people have hacked through it, there are places where people have dug under it, and there are places where it's just open because the two contractors, each did their part. This section of wall, people were coming through by the hundreds in November and December in some really foul weather. And, we heard about it, and we got volunteers out there, and basically the story was if people hadn't been there, sitting vigil overnight, making fires, providing blankets, people would have died. And from that started to grow a project of leaving some supplies along this part of the wall and then creating a very makeshift camp, again, from which this picture is taken, that didn't have any sanitation. I think now has some porta potties that somebody donated, but didn't have any sanitation, just had some old tents that occasionally got vandalized by the militia. Militia is a thing you see every day. And we started just trying to help people. And so they were coming through a particular section that was 17 miles from the Border Patrol station in Sasa Bay. So the thing that most folks don't know is that more people who are crossing the border are looking for Border Patrol than trying to run away from it, because they want to file an asylum claim. We'll get to why they can't do that at a port of entry in a moment, but they're coming through and they're like, get me to Border Patrol, right? But there are families with infants and elders, and they're 17 miles from the Border Patrol station that they don't really know how to reach anyway, but it's 17 miles away. There's no shelter, there's no facilities, there's no water, there's no food, and that's where we ended up, just creating this extreme sort of humanitarian aid stopgap. So that was a significant part of the work. that population coming through that section of the wall has waxed and waned over the months, and which is another thing that's true of all of this work. It is the only constant is change. You know, there's a season when there's 60 people in camp every night, and then 4. You know, some of that has to do with the cartel wars. You know, you can be sitting in bird camp and listening to gunshots and know that, yeah, you know, that's going to stop the traffic for a while, because guides are not going to bring their people across in the middle of a turf war. So there's so many factors that determine so much of what's going on. The last thing I want to say about the work is that No More Deaths is part of a completely unofficial but fairly broad network of other groups that are doing similar work in one form or another. I think No More Deaths is probably among the most sophisticated, if not the most sophisticated, with the most infrastructure and resources. But I know that there, for instance, they were talking about taking one of their old trucks and giving it to some folks in El Paso who were bringing water out as far as their 2-wheel drives could take it, you know, and meanwhile they've recovered 40 bodies, you know, in the mountains just beyond that in 1 month, you know. So there are networks of people all across that area that are doing humanitarian aid. I just want to mention that. I want to say something about the people. And first thing you will have noticed is that I didn't have any photos of people crossing, and that's for obvious safety reasons, right? Respect their privacy and know that they're vulnerable. I'm not going to take their pictures, which also feels intrusive even if it weren't dangerous, and it is dangerous. But they are people with, you know, children, elders, single people. Almost everybody that crosses these days comes with a guide. I'll say more about that again later. And particularly along the wall, there are people from all over the world. I mean, literally every continent except for Antarctica. And as this photo attests, they are very often people of faith. This is the shrine that's in Bird Camp, a camp that's otherwise very functional and efficient. It has water, it has shelter, it has food, and it has this beautiful shrine. As you can see, well loved and well visited. And the Virgin is everywhere, as you would expect. I just want to give a few snapshots of some of the people that we saw. There was one point in which we were driving along the wall during this time of crisis of people crossing there, and we literally saw a group of people coming through one of these holes in the wall and pulled up, you know, to offer them food and water, and they were terrified, as you might expect, because they don't know who we are yet, right? And there was this one family unit that I just saw, and they were just holding each other's hands, shaking. You know, toddlers, teenagers, grandparents. And that really, really stuck with me. There was a girl who had an ankle injury. She had sprained or broken an ankle, but it also was bloody and it had rocks stuck in it. And the medic who was treating her didn't speak Spanish, so we had 2 people working with her, a person who was talking to her in Spanish and interpreting, but also just talking to her, and the medic who was, you know, having to clean this wound. And at first, this girl just was very stoic. And then as, you know, as they're talking and as there's this human connection, she just starts to cry and cry and cry and cry. Not from the ankle, from the whole thing, right? But then we came into camp one day and there were 2 guys playing chess. You know, somebody had asked to bring a chess set, in which we did, and there were these 2 guys playing chess, and then we played some chess with them. Not me, I don't play chess, but one of the other volunteers played chess. There was a day that we were working in the camp the makeshift camp, not bird camp, the camp by the border wall. And it was full of people, and there were, we had a medic station, and we had people getting firewood, and there were 2 people making ramen. We had like pallets of ramen, like whole pallets of ramen that we went through like weekly. And so we had this old two-burner Coleman stove, and then we used 2 huge pots, like you see in a soup kitchen or in one of our churches, right? Like huge pots. And one would come to a boil, and you just throw in 10, 20, 30 packets of ramen, wait, and then have the other one on. So like while we were serving from one, the other one was going. And there were 2 people doing that. And at one point, one of them was also a medic, got called away. And I stepped in to take her place, and then the other person that was there got called away for something else. There was a medical emergency and an evacuation that had to happen. And then I was managing the 2 pots of ramen and this endless line of people with these little plastic bowls and spoons. And like, if you ever tried to serve ramen, it doesn't stay. And, so my hands were just all covered in burns, and I just ended up handing it to people with like ramen slopped over the side. And then somebody came over to me and said, I need you to help me drive the wall. And I said, sure, I just need to find somebody to take over the ramen. And she said, no, there's no one. M&M had to do the medical evacuation, and Luce is sitting on first aid. It's just gonna have to be self-served like it was the other night. And so we got in the truck because there were people coming, and we needed to bring, the people that are most able-bodied could make it on foot to the camp. The people who could not, they were just huddled by fires along the wall, and you had to bring them water and food. So that was, a typical experience. The last thing I want to mention is that one of the things that happens, so in this area, Border Patrol was coming, and again, remember, these are folks who want to see Border Patrol, right? So one of the bizarre things that happened in this situation is that we would call Border Patrol and be like, come do your job. These people want to be filing an asylum claim, come get them, bring them to the station, let them file their claim. God only knows what happens to them, but that's what they want, and we're not there to tell these people what to do. We're there to keep them alive, right? So interaction with Border Patrol was an interesting part of this experience that I had not expected at all. But one of the things that happens is that when Border Patrol does show up, like particularly in this makeshift camp, it's everybody in right now. And then what's left behind in the tents, it's like a backpack, a Bible, so many Bibles, some crayons, a shirt, a little tiny boombox, and this prayer card that I found. It's a famous prayer, a prayer for difficult cases, that Carol translated for me helpfully. It's a classic prayer to St. Jude. And St. Jude is invoked, as it says here, the patron of difficult and desperate causes. Pray for me that I may receive the consolations of heaven in all my needs, tribulations, and suffering. And that really stuck with me. I put the card in my wallet, it's still there. So that's the work. And now we're going to talk about why the hell is this happening? Pardon my language in a church. Let me see what time it is. All right. I'm going to try to wrap this up in about 10 minutes. And then, because I want us to have some conversation. And this is basically the end of the slideshow. I'll leave this up for a minute, and then I'll just close the laptop. It's hard to do this succinctly. I will say this. In 1994, the U.S. government came up with a policy they call prevention through deterrence that said, oh, you know what? Crossing the border in remote areas is really dangerous. Let's make sure that's where people have to cross, and maybe they won't cross because it's so dangerous. It's literally the policy of the United States. This is still the policy of the United States, to push people to cross in the most remote and dangerous areas on the border. Now, the very predictable result is that people still choose to cross the border because what they're fleeing is worse than what they're facing, but they die by the hundreds, and they suffer. They suffer as they cross. That's the origin of the militarization of the border that has just taken on, different waves, whether it's like the CBP on horseback, whipping the migrants, or them putting shit in the Rio Grande to try to drown people, or closing the ports and just forcing people into this remote desert area. The wall, even with its holes, basically just contributes to that problem of creating life-threatening conditions. This militarization of the border that we've had now for 3 decades is, one of the side effects that I'm sure the U.S. government would pretend it cared about, but it doesn't, is that it strengthens the hand of the cartels immensely. Because nobody dares, not nobody, but almost nobody dares cross alone. You get a guide. They run the guide business, The guides are, you notice I'm not using the word coyote. The guides vary, some of them are kind of harsh, some of them are really nice. It's a business, they work for the cartels because they can't get other work. But if you cared about the cartels and weakening them, you wouldn't have this policy. And like I said, hundreds of people die, thousands have never been recovered. So I'll close this now. That's part one of the policy stuff. The second part that I want to lift up is the ports of entry and how you actually get through a port of entry. So when we were there, the ports in that area had been closed for weeks and weeks and weeks, and they had just recently reopened. But the way that you get through a port of entry now is you have to make an appointment on an app called the CBP One app that you can only do in the north of Mexico because it's geofenced, so you have to be in the region. You have to make this appointment on an app, and then on a daily basis, the government chooses by lottery a random number of people that they're going to call who have signed up on the app to cross. It's throttled, right? So they do like 1,000 people a day, and there's like 6 million that are in the pipeline. 6 million's the wrong number, but an enormous number. And you have to wait. You end up sort of putting yourself in the system over and over and over and over again. So what happens is that if you go to the port without a CBP1 appointment, they just turn you back. You can't walk across and then just say, I want to file an asylum claim. You have to have a stamp appointment, and you have to have your lottery number called. So the official way to file asylum is to navigate a government app, which means you have to have that literacy, you have to have a smartphone, you have to have internet access, and then you have to be in the northern half of Mexico for roughly 3 or 4 months, which is on average what it takes to get your number called. That's the official way. There are people suing the government saying that this denies the fundamental right to asylum, which of course is absolutely true. Now, the other part of the policy is that we now have a ban on asylum at the border. This was a Trump policy that at the time was decried as extremely radical, that we were just denying the fundamental right to asylum. What that meant is you cross the border, and instead of being allowed to file asylum, which is your right under U.S. law and international law. That is the legal way to file asylum, is to cross the border and make an application, right? Instead of being permitted to do that, your right under the law, they were just rounded up, put back over the border. So fundamentally denied, no due process, no chance, no anything, just summarily expelled from the country. Joe Biden resurrected that policy in June, and then just like last week, he made it tougher. You know, it's technically, it's tied to a number of people that cross the border, but that number is it has to be so low that there's no chance that it's going to be lifted, right? So this policy, between the militarization of the border and the asylum ban, that is just a crushing blow to the ability to file asylum, the ability to get into this country and have a chance. So the asylum ban that was, you know, the worst of Trump is now owned by the Democratic Party. So I want to say just there that border policy is a bipartisan betrayal. It has been for a very long time. 1994 was the Clinton years, as you may remember. There were other horrible immigration policies that happened under Clinton, but I'm focused on the border. And yet, at the same time, the white Christian nationalists in this country would like to make this even worse. You know, those signs you saw at the Republican convention, mass deportations now. You know, we have mass deportations. Hundreds of thousands of people are deported every year. That is mass deportation. They want to scale that. But I want to be clear, actually, that there's not much more they could do on the border itself that would make this worse. You know, on the interior, there's things that could get way worse in the interior. But on the border, it really is bad. It is bad. Segueing. You all know this, but you don't need to go to Arizona or El Paso to see and encounter migrants and asylum seekers who are in desperate straits and are being given the shaft by our government. We've had people coming to New York for centuries, right? But particularly in the last 2 years, an influx of people originally, you know, used as pawns in a political game between Greg Abbott and the East Coast. And then Eric Adams' response being basically to take a page out of the Republicans' handbook and declare it a crisis and call these people a crisis instead of welcoming them to this city of immigrants and creating an entire secondary shelter system that has way fewer protections, and then adding to that shelter evictions on a 30 and 60-day cycle. This church, like many, but particularly this church, has done an amazing ministry in responding to that crisis. And there's so much amazing work happening in some of the churches, in the mutual aid community. There's a lot. And if you want to plug into that, you don't need to go to the border. You don't need to hike up the mountain. I chose that because it suited my personality. But you can come and do that work here. And in that context, I just want to lift up one thing. There's a bill in the City Council called Intro 210, the Stop Shelter Evictions bill, that would undo this 30 and 60-day rule that uproots families every 60 days and uproots individuals every 30 days. It needs a lot of help. That bill does not have a majority, let alone a veto-proof majority yet. And I did not have time to bring you like postcards or information on it. So go home and Google it and sign yourself up to help pass it. Lastly, just a little bit of perspective from a theological point of view. You know, when I was there when I was doing water drops, like hiking into the mountains and leaving water and socks and food, I never even saw the people that used that stuff. And when I was in bird camp and I would clean the toilets, that was a job I always signed up for because I'm such a composting toilets fan. I never saw anybody who used the toilet that I cleaned, although I thought about them. I thought about like what it must be like to sit on a clean toilet for the first time in God knows how long. And that was, apart from the composting, that was a really huge motivation for me. And then at the wall we actually did see people, right? And they spoke Hindi, they spoke Punjabi, they spoke Spanish, they spoke French, they spoke Arabic, a minority of Spanish actually in that area. I don't speak any of those languages. You know, so I never knew the story of any person that I saw, where they were from, where they were going, why they had to leave home. And it didn't matter. That's the important part. It didn't matter. I could stick out my hand with a bottle of water or a granola bar and speak the language of human need. And that's what was needed in that moment. In Mark 3, I'm going to preach for just a moment. I promise you it'll be very short. Mark 3 is the story of the man with the withered hand, right? Context. Withered hand in that era meant you couldn't work. That meant total destitution. Jesus heals this man, no questions asked. Doesn't ask where he came from, where he's going, why he's there, how his hand got withered, whether maybe he could do it all with one hand or, no, man needed healing, he heals him. Barry Hendricks, in his book, The Politics of Jesus, talks about this ministry of Jesus, this bodily ministry of Jesus, as treating the people's needs as holy, which is a phrase that I have run into Hendricks a few times and told him that I use it all the time, but I always give him credit. It is such a beautiful image to treat the people's needs as holy. And what I came to understand on the border is that's what humanitarian aid is. That's what it is, the language of human needs. There's no requirement, there's no asking, there's just, are people thirsty? Give them water. Are they hungry? Give them food. Are they cold? Give them shelter. But there's more to this story, and Hendricks talks about this too. Hendricks talks about Jesus telling people that the present order, the order of the world as it was, sinned against the justice of God because it sinned against their needs. And that's what happens in this story in Mark 3, too. You know, the setup of the story is there's some local elites who are like, oh, it's the Sabbath. Let's see if we can trap Jesus into doing something that's against the law, right? And Jesus knows all this. He sizes it up, and he's like, I'm going to heal the man, you know? That's the example. The criterion there is the human need, not the law. Sometimes you have to break the law to meet the need. And sometimes people weaponize the law to try to stop your ministry, to try to keep you from treating the people's needs as holy. I want to end with an image from my journal. From that day, I think it was the same day that I was talking about where I was doing the big ramen line and then driving the wall, and you know, like it's 10 o'clock, it's 11 o'clock at night, and the day was done. I'll just read it. Then we huddled up with the whole crew, decided that things were stable, everyone was fed, there were no serious medical issues, and things were calm. We made a round through the camp, letting people know we were leaving. And as we were walking back to the trucks, I looked around and I saw dozens of small fires with circles of people around them, wrapped in blankets. There was conversation, sometimes laughter, around each circle. And I marveled at the human capacity for resilience and the awesome power of community. Thank you. You're going to be Vanna White?
I'm going to be Phil Donahue.
Oh.
That's why, if I can get this to work.
Yeah. All right.
Test one, two. Oh, wow. Are there
Yeah,
any?
so comments, questions, discussion, I hope it's sort of a 360 discussion. Somebody get us going.
I'll kick it off with two because I think this relates to that. Why didn't you pick some of them up and take them to the Border Patrol, or what? I mean, I think I know the answer, but what? Again, it's one of those laws, I think. But
Okay, I'm going to go out on a limb here. We consider transporting somebody to a humanitarian aid camp to be humanitarian aid and thus legal. The United States government does not always agree. So I will say that hypothetically, we might have offered a ride to some people. Hypothetically.
and it would have been the right thing. So.
It would have been the right thing.
And one other question I have is, why not just coordinate with the coyotes or, you know, the guides to, why not just coordinate with them?
I don't know that that's really possible, but I think that the migrant routes, I mean, certainly some of them are fairly well established, right? And we, No More Deaths continually is doing research on, like, you know, like you go to a drop site every 3 to 6 weeks, depending on how fast it moves. And sometimes we see that this site is no longer moving at all. We come back and the water's still there, it's still there. And then we're trying to figure out why. And like, where is this traffic that used to come here going? And then we hear of a need in a new corridor and we start scouting new routes. And I don't know how we would actually do that working with them. I will say that the guides know where the camp is. And they will bring people, you know, they will bring groups through there. And they probably know that there is water in, they may even know, you know, where our drop sites are. But it's not a coordination, but I think we're providing something that is a known resource.
Great, great. Yeah. Oh, I'll get to you in a second, Kay.
This might be a related question, but in the slide where it showed the blue pile of things on the hillside, and it looked like a little dot, how do people know? I mean, it was hard to see in the picture.
Yes.
So is there a reason not to put like a little flag there or something? Would that be?
The main reason to not do that would be that Border Patrol does regularly sabotage the supplies, particularly the water. They will slash water supplies. Talk about, you know, sabotaging ministry to treat the people's needs as holy.
Were they on like what you're talking about, like a route that that people would travel and would actually find
so the drops are all along something that someone has deemed, you know, a route that is usually traveled. And the fact that they, by and large, are always empty when we get there shows that that's true. And I think that that is related to sort of Paul's hunch, right, that the guides know, you know, the guides know the routes, the guides know No More Deaths is there, they know where the camp is. So I think there are some sites that are a little bit more obvious. I included that photo mainly because it just sort of, it spoke to the scale for me.
Yes, yeah.
You know, this tiny little dot in this barren, beautiful but barren desert.
Yeah. And just another, you mentioned that the Virgin is everywhere. Are they mostly images of the Virgin of Guadalupe, or just?
Yeah, I think.
Because I couldn't tell from that one picture that you had was sort of at a side.
Yeah.
It sort of looked like the rays of the sun, and that's.
I think,
always
but
has that
I am
around
not really very good with the Catholic icons.
Yeah. But that would make sense.
That, I think, is,
yeah,
I think,
yeah.
but,
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, you mentioned about the vigilante groups, and
Oh, yeah.
I wanted to hear, I mean, that just astonishes me, people doing what they do for reasons I can't get my brain around. Is there anything more you could tell us about?
we call them militias. They, in my experience, and it sounded like the experience of longer-term volunteers and No More Deaths, they are a harassing and a nuisance presence, and they have not been actively violent. They do some property damage sometimes, but mainly they intimidate. And so what they would do, for instance, is they would pull up to this makeshift camp and start filming. And they're always armed, visibly armed, you know. They're carrying. Sometimes they would taunt you. Sometimes they would just try to film. You know, there was one bizarre encounter that we had with somebody posing as, you know, a politician from Idaho who wanted to know about the border crisis, and, you know, and then it became clear that that was a ruse when they started going and filming people, and then, you know, things got a little heated. But as Carol says, de-escalation is not your strong suit. I'm not the person for that job, but mainly an intimidating force. You know, sometimes we think, you know, slashing the tents, but a little hard to know.
Any other questions?
Intimidate, there to intimidate?
So let me repeat the question, because
Yeah.
it's for our online audience too. How do you actually get rid of them?
The militia folks. Yeah, so you basically, you wait them out. And I'll share a story that Carol also knows, because you watched the live stream, right? There was a group, there were a group of us, like 4 women, I think, who went to the makeshift camp on a day. It was a rainy day, and it was empty. Like, you know, that particular day, no one had come through, and we were like, hallelujah, well, let's do some cleaning, right? So we reorganized the supply shed, we secured like the food under a tarp. I built like makeshift shelters because, you know, the tents were kind of in ratty condition, and somebody organized the clothing, you know, women doing work. And these guys rolled up in an SUV and got out and started to film. There were 2 of them, you know, pistols, you know, whatever, and they're here. One of them's with a really fancy camera, and one of them's just with a cell phone. And all they saw was us cleaning. And they lasted 5 hours. We were there much longer, but they live streamed the whole thing. And apparently we're talking about us Marxists that were like, you know, fomenting the border invasion. And so I just think of it as the Marxist cleaning incident. I mean, there are absurdities like that, but in that case, we just, you know, we actually sent a bat signal out because we were 4 women, and they were 2 men that were armed. And, you know, it was okay. Again, I should not be the de-escalator, but yeah, they just gave up after 5 hours of live streaming the Marxist cleaning brigade.
Sometimes mocking is the best weapon. So.
I mean, I love the fact that they came there to film a border invasion, and all they saw was a bunch of women cleaning.
Paul, I saw the Southern Boer War. So that I remember, I think about China. In ancient China, we have the Great War, and that's the northern China, to defend the northern people to invent China. Now, I think that the people close the Southern Boer War, the organization, no more deaths, want to help them, want that no people die inside these sites. So this organization want to build the bridge, not the wall. Now, my question is, do you have any example really to save some people, they didn't die, to by your help? Yeah, do you have any really example for that?
Literal examples of when we know that we saved lives?
Thank you.
There are people that come through bird camp and receive life-saving medical treatment, for sure. There are people, and again, I wasn't there, but at the end of 2023, in what became the camp on the wall, that were kept alive by volunteers who sat vigil all night and made fires and provided blankets, that we are relatively certain not all would have survived that one night in particular when it was storming like horizontal sheets of rain. It's unknown how many people that find, the 12 gallons of water that we leave, had that 12 gallons of water not been there, would survive. It's an unknown thing, and we do know that hundreds of people still die every year. We can't say for sure how many more if we weren't doing it. So there are some very specific cases where we know we saved a life, but there is a nebulous hunch that those supplies are saving lives. Not all of them. Not all of them.
Hi. It's really a touching and important story to tell, and thank you so much for sharing this with us. I hope this can be heard by more people. So, could you share a bit about the toilet? The composting toilet.
Oh. Okay. You're my new favorite person. I first encountered composting toilets in the White Mountains in the 90s, where the hiker traffic was so great that the Appalachian Mountain Club decided that a better way to manage the resources and manage the waste was to use composting technology. And they had the brilliant idea of posting on the inside of the outhouse like a 4-page explanation of how it works, which means everybody read it, right? So that's how I learned about composting toilets, and became a fan and stayed a fan. The way it works is that the bacteria that are in the material that you put in the toilet, they raise the temperature and they break down, and when you add some wood chips and you create like a mix of bacteria that, for reasons that I don't understand because I wasn't good at chemistry either, raises the temperature. And when the temperature reaches a certain point, like the bacteria are dead, they get killed. And then that pile becomes basically safe manure. It ceases to be a carrier of disease. It also ceases to smell. Eventually. So the way that it works, particularly at bird camp, is you have these big containers. They're big plastic containers that sit under the outhouse, right? So you have a nice toilet seat and a big hole like you would in a normal outhouse, but underneath is this big ass, excuse my language, container. And you ask people, when they do their poop, they take a handful of sawdust, they throw it down there. And you do that, and then the person that's maintaining the toilet comes through every couple of days, and they take this big, long stir, and they stir it all up, they add some more sawdust, they stir it all up so that everything is evenly distributed. When the bin is, like half full, 2/3 full, it gets pulled out of service. You put a new fresh bin in, and you put that bin, you close it, you seal it off, you put it in the sun for another month, and it just bakes. And then when you open it up, it doesn't smell like anything, and you got compost. It's amazing. And it really, for, both in the White Mountains where I first encountered it and in this situation, it solves a solid waste problem in a way that is manageable and ecological and scalable, honestly, It's really amazing. Thank you for asking. Wait, Alicia, we're gonna let you ask it so the live stream can hear you.
So are there any, maybe I'm asking you to tell a trade secret, but what's the plan for the future other than the fact that we want, immigration policies to be better? But what are people doing on the ground? Is there a next wave of greater thinking on how they want to help people along that route, that 17-mile route? Are there any new ideas about making it easier? How you bring more people in, this sounds silly, Wi-Fi, whatever.
No More Deaths recruits. I don't think they're more a program of attraction than promotion. There are people who want to volunteer with No More Deaths all the time, and they run a volunteer orientation at least once a month. So there's always constantly new people coming in. And, some people who travel from far away like me do what's called the month-long program, and that's your initiation. You spend a whole month doing this stuff, and then you're invited to come back whenever you have time to give. And about half the people that do the month-long become long-term volunteers. And then there's this huge core of local volunteers, and there's new local volunteers every month as well. There's new local volunteers every week, but they do an orientation once a month. So, and there's an ongoing conversation. The governance, that's the word, of the organization runs also non-hierarchically, collectively volunteer run in real time on internet, secure internet channels. And there's constant innovation and thinking about there's a piece of land we're thinking of buying, or there's a piece of land that we already own, what can we do with it? Or there's this truck that, we can't fix, but the guy in El Paso that, who doesn't have four-wheel drive, he's actually a mechanic, so why don't we give it to him? Or if we invested in, at one point there was a conversation about putting Porto Sands in that makeshift camp, because we did have a sanitation problem there. But that's an expense, because there's a service that comes and cleans them, and and fundraising for that. So there's always that kind of stuff. I don't know that there's anything brilliantly new that can be done to fix the crisis, but there's always innovation. The only constant is change.
So is this considered civil disobedience and do you get challenged on that ground?
It's not civil disobedience. It is called civil initiative, which is direct provision of aid to people who need it. Our interpretation of law is that all of it is humanitarian aid and therefore protected. No More Deaths camps have been raided on a regular basis, on and off. There was one famous case, I think the most famous case, a gentleman named Scott Warren, who was a volunteer was arrested along with some other folks and charged with harboring. That would be the charge that, you know, if we were hypothetically giving somebody a ride somewhere, that, you know, we would say humanitarian aid, they would say harboring. And this was during the Trump years, and they put him on trial, and the jury acquitted him. So there was a big win in the legal column on that. But civil initiative would be the category, not civil disobedience. Are we done?
Thank you so much, Benz. This has been a
My
wonderful
pleasure.
presentation.
Thank you all for coming. Goodbye, live stream. Okay. It's warm in here. Salad, lots of salad.